Yeah.
I was going to ask you, Stephen, because I'm curious. I'm naturally drawn towards the epic. Like, I think the main things that inspire me are like the big stories, like Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, things like that. Just like make my head explode and make me want to write. But when I think about writing something short, I kind of get a bit confused. What do I make happen when I've got so little space and there's no empires collapsing or anything? Like,
yeah.
How does that work?
How does that work? I suppose for me, because, well, if I'm writing extremely short things, 50 words, I'm not really attempting to tell a story as such. It's usually just like, or am I? Well, not really. I mean, they're supposed to be funny, my 50-word stories. So they're usually just like a comic idea, which I kind of like try and explore in 50 words. And if I'm writing actual short stories, as I say, they've usually been mostly about an incident. I recall, they're usually based on autobiography, like on an incident or a person that I can just like write a short, concentrated thing about, which I feel sort of most comfortable doing. Oddly enough, I read novels. I don't actually read short stories much. I don't know about you, but I tend to read different things from what I write. So I like getting lost in a novel. I don't read many short stories, but I read a lot of historical fiction so it does endlessly fascinate me how people do it. And I suppose with yourself, one big question would be, storytelling has been mostly what you've done, hasn't it? And I suppose one thing I was thinking, because you've been all over the world storytelling, haven't you? And to what degree stories have things in common wherever you go? Because I suppose you've told and gathered stories around the world. I mean, is there a lot that binds stories together, no matter which part of the world you go to, or do you find a lot of variety in how stories are told and the kinds of stories that are told?
Yeah, it's incredible how much does bind stories together. You've got a whole classification system for stories, the Arne Thompson thing, I think it's called, where you look up any story, say Cinderella, and it says, this is Arne Thompson type 451, the maiden who marries the prince, or something like that. They tend to go from culture to culture and kind of change their form or change their clothes as they go. And this may seem like, well, kind of obvious, because they seem like some of them seem like plots. Well, yeah, you can imagine people would have made up something like that in different places. But some of them, it's just weird. Like, for example, there's this kind of story where you have a wizard or a giant who keeps his heart outside of his body. He keeps it hidden somewhere else, and you can't kill him without destroying the heart. This is the basis of the Horcruxes. But he doesn't just, you'd think, okay, well, imagine in one place it's kept in this, and another place it's kept in that. In stories from Russia, from Scotland, from North America, Africa, he keeps it inside an animal, and inside it's another animal, and then another animal, another animal. Usually there's a duck, and then you get to an egg, and it's in the egg. And it's just incredible. And well, there's kind of two theories. One is that stories, just over the course of thousands of years, storytellers just passed them on, and this storyteller got to this far, passed it to this storyteller, who gave it to this guy, and they went across the world. And there's also the theory that these stories are kind of like archetypal forms that arise in the minds of people in different parts of the world. Some people believe one, some people believe the other, some people believe it's a bit of both. I think one thing I would just say that I find interesting is that there do seem to be stories like this that naturally want to move. They want to travel, they're nomadic, and they crop up all over the place. But then there are other stories which are very specific to place. They're about place, and they have a kind of ritual function or even a practical function. Like, for instance, the Aboriginals will tell stories that are about very specific places, and knowing that story might tell you where to find water or where to find food or a particular plant. So you don't take that story and then just set it over there, because you're going to send someone off in the wrong direction. I spoke to a storyteller from the Isle of Skye, a Clan Seneca, a traditional storyteller, and he was saying, yeah, there's a story which tells you how to navigate your way from this part of the island to another across quite a dangerous passage. So there are stories which are very specific to a place.
That's interesting about the whole, about the whole purpose of stories as well, doesn't it? And the different purposes of stories, from ranging from, I suppose, pure entertainment to kind of being instructive, or maybe teaching about your past or your people's past. Whatever. I mean, there must, I suppose, a whole different range of reasons for stories, which possibly would be similar around the world in some senses, but that mixture of entertainment and instruction and I don't know. I would imagine the same purposes of stories may recur. I don't know. But,
so, yeah, I think all cultures have stories which they tell for entertainment. Some, just for a bit of a laugh. Some which are kind of about their identity. This is who we are. This is who we were. These are our heroes from the past. And then there are the myths where it's more deeply who we are. This is how the world was made. These are our gods. And of course, that's a whole different function altogether.
Yeah, and I suppose kind of, if the word moral isn't too much, but I suppose stories that are supposed to have like a lesson in them as well, aren't they? I suppose, like about what are right and wrong things to do and so forth. I would imagine would recur in all cultures as well.
Yeah, I'm quite sensitive to that topic because I tend to get upset when I'm in a school and the teacher says at the end of the story, well, children, what was the moral of that story?
Yeah.
Because I think there's so much to them, so much to learn, and I think it's interesting to look at how much this is true of great literature, and perhaps you can speak about that, Philippa, as well as traditional stories. But I think they're more like I was thinking the idea of the smoking mirror. Some cultures, they have these dark mirrors which you look into, and they were used for scrying or prophecy, so people would kind of see different things each time. The smoking mirror, and I think our stories are like that. They contain reflections for different people in different times, and they might have a different lesson for you yesterday and a different one today. So I don't like anything which smacks of reducing them to one thing, but yeah, I think they have a huge amount to teach us.
Yeah,
it'd be interesting to speak about. Well, so you write quite suspenseful stuff, Philippa. What's your drive? Do you see it as entertainment or having a different purpose?
Yeah, I mean, I think you made this distinction before about plot versus character, and I think there is kind of a bit stereotyping, but for example, literary fiction often focuses a lot more on a character's internal psychological journey in some time in their life, and then you have at the other end got very commercial fiction, which is very plot based. It might be kind of Jack Reacher action story or something like that. And I think for me, although my books are kind of marketed as commercial fiction, right? We're not trying to be literary, but the way that I see it is that plot and character and theme can all come together. So the way that I try to write is I try to package my stories in a fairly page-turnery structure with quite good pace and quite good suspense. And that basically just means organizing where you end your scenes and chapters. So, or ending them on something that's a little bit, feels like a tiny bit of a cliffhanger, even if it's an emotional cliffhanger. To just make the reader feel like they want to have a sense of what's going to happen next. So I tend to take kind of traditional pacing and structures of things like the psychological thriller and stuff like that. But for me, I do like to try and explore, to have my stories explore something about how we live our lives. So the choices that the character makes in the course of that story and how that story ultimately resolves. Usually I try to make it that my characters have a really powerful emotional or psychological choice or emotional or psychological revelation at the climax of the book, so that the way that they respond to that revelation or the choice that they make in that crisis moment is me trying to explore something about the choices that we may all be faced with in our lives. So I try to try to kind of, as I say, kind of package it in a sort of page-turnery commercial thing. But I do like to try and explore, I mean, I'm a psychologist in my day job, so the whole sort of aspect of the human condition and yeah, how we live our lives, how we should confront situations, who we should try to be, what the best courses of action are when we encounter crises in our lives. That really interests me, and I think that gives books another, they can be entertaining and you can enjoy turning the pages, but they can then have another level which you can take something away from them, about that you might learn something about yourself or about the world. So yeah, that's what I try to do anyway. That's my kind of vision and ambition that I'm always trying to aim for in my writing. Yeah.
Do you think that's something that would,
sorry, go on.
do you think that's something that would just kind of naturally arise because that's what you're interested in, even if you weren't consciously trying to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it's like, it probably is a reflection of the kind of books that I like to read as well. Like one of my huge inspirations was the psychological thriller Gone Girl, which was just everywhere a few years ago. And I think that was such a good example of a really gripping plot, but also just exploring really complicated ideas about, you know, relationships and how we relate to ourselves and each other. And I think that was the first time that I'd read a commercial book that felt like it had incredible depth. I'd read a lot of literary fiction and Penguin classics up to that point. I was a bit steeped in that and didn't really know how to access commercial fiction. And then this was sort of a book that I thought, wow, that marries the two so well. That's what I want to do, basically. Not that I do it as well as Gillian Flynn, but that's my inspiration. And it sounds like for you, Daniel, it sounds like you also really like this idea of providing your reader with something to reflect on, as well as some sort of epic plot and maybe battle scenes and things. And you do it in even more of a nuanced way, that perhaps you try to tell stories that can be read in different ways for different readers at different times.
Well, yeah, I really like what you're saying there about how, you know, there's no reason a thriller can't have wonderful, deep characters in it. I feel the same way about fantasy. Like, I feel like in fantasy, you can do everything you can do in literary fiction, and you can throw in some dragons. As Sanderson put it. So win-win. So I'm hugely influenced by Robin Hobb, who's my favorite fantasy author, who writes. I believe that her characterization is as good as anything I've read in any literary book. But it just happens to also have an incredible fantasy world in it as well. So I don't write as well as Robin Hobb, but that's kind of what I'm going for. And,
what about you, Stephen? Like, do you, because you perform or you read a lot of your pieces live, so do you have a sense of like what you want to offer your audience or your readers? Like, what's it about for you when you write and share that with an audience?
Well, I mean, most of the performing I've done has been 50-word stories, which are basically meant to be funny. So they stand or fall if anybody laughs at them or not, really, I suppose. But so yeah, that's what I want from that. Although, I mean, I have read other short stories to people, and it's funny because I'm so used to performing with a response I want is for someone to laugh, that it can be quite hard to assess almost that how a short story you've read has gone down, unless somebody comes up to you afterwards and says that was great, you know, or something else. It can be hard to. I mean, suppose you can tell. Well, I don't know. You can possibly tell if people are listening and gripped by it or not. But it's funny, isn't it? Different types of performing, because I mean, Daniel, you'll be performing when you're telling a story. You know, obviously you can see how the audience is responding, I suppose, to a degree. And if I'm doing something that's supposed to be funny and if people can laugh, I can tell the audience are responding. I think if someone's reading a kind of serious piece, it's the relationship with the audience is different, I think, in terms of how they respond. You probably only find out afterwards if they come and speak to you. Yeah, it's quite interesting, because I think with the 50-word stories, I've got terrible capacity for memorizing things. So 50 words I can usually just about manage to memorize particularly the older ones that I wrote ages ago and have performed a long time, performed many times. But I'm kind of in awe of those performance poets who can memorize kind of like massive screeds of stuff and then sort of deliver it with great gusto. I don't always like it, but I'm sort of in awe of the fact that they can do it. But so there's so many different responses to performing things, because I mean, like with yourself, Daniel, it must be again. I mentioned about the difference between performing and then sitting down and writing stuff as well, and performing a story and what that involves compared with sitting down and writing it as well, and how different that feels.
Well, with the novel, it's such a long slog. You can be writing something for years and never share it with anyone. No one gets to read it, and they might occasionally ask politely about it, but they don't know this other world that you're living in. And I tend to say this as if, imagine that your family and friends had never met your child. You talked about, sometimes they asked about it, and you talked a little bit. They'd never met them. It's like that if you've got a novel until you finally get to share it. So I find that quite a struggle. I had a novel I was working on for 7 years, my first one. So with storytelling, it's instant satisfaction. You can learn a story and just gone and told it an hour later, and just see how this goes. So you get that feedback and you get that connection. So it's a really nice balance to me, because I love the immediacy and the connection and the sharing of, isn't this amazing? One of those people who discovers something and just has to put it in front of people. So that's what you get to do as a storyteller, which makes up for all that time with your novel not sharing it. But then the depth of the process and the depth of what you can create with the novel, the rewards are so great. It's just a shame that you can't be there with the person sitting next to them and kind of while they're reading and say, oh, do you like that bit? Do you like that bit? Because I kind of want to do that. But yeah, you can.
Is it quite comparatively nerve-wracking then, really, like releasing a book for somebody to kind of, the like, you're effectively not there anymore, and they're just free to draw their own conclusions, and is it quite, do you kind of want to be like, well, but they're meant to be like this though, and it's you're supposed to understand this in this way, or do you feel quite kind of, it's done, it's in the world, it's not my thing anymore?
I don't feel like I need to defend it, but I feel like I just want to talk about it with them, and I want to sit there with them and go through the whole thing and be like, well, I just want to share it with them. I just want to be there with them. How do you find, Philippa, because you're the novel writing, but you're not doing the oral storytelling?
Yeah, I've never really done any performing of my pieces other than maybe reading something out, on something like this, for example. But so I'm kind of in awe of you guys. I don't think I'd want an audience right there in my face. And yeah, like for me, I'm a very private writer, so maybe I can understand, Daniel, because you're creating these fantastic worlds, and I can understand it could feel a little bit lonely that you're the only one getting to run around in them and have all the fun, and it'd be nice to have a companion to adventure around with. For me, I write quite privately. I have to work the story out by myself first. I don't want anyone interfering early on, because I need to try and get clear on what I'm trying to do and what I'm trying to say. And then I usually would get some trusted people to read for me to help me editorially. And that can be a really nice collaborative process where you know what you're trying to achieve, but you haven't really quite got there and haven't quite figured out how to get there, and they can just help you with that, really. And yeah, I think definitely with getting published, like I took the decision quite early on that I just wouldn't read any reviews, because I can't, like you were saying, Katie, I can't change anything now, so either people like what I've written and they get a sense of what I was trying to say, or they don't. And the nice reviews tend to find me, like someone will forward it to me, and that's lovely. And if I read a bad review, well, I'm just going to feel bad and can't do anything with it. So I think, for me, it's kind of writing in private, getting trusted people to help me editorially to get it to what I'm trying to do. And then when people read it and if they enjoy it, that's the best thing. But to be honest, at that point, it's out of my hands. So it's kind of, I'm a bit like, good luck to you guys. I don't know, whatever. If you enjoy it, great, but I can't help you if you don't. So, yeah.
That was very wise of those reviews, I think. Because have you sort of read extracts of your novel at festivals and things like that, or have you not really had to do anything anything like that? Sort of read extracts of it in place.
Yeah, I mean, because of COVID, basically, most of the in-person events that I was signed up for have been cancelled. So the readings that I've done have been like this, been pre-recorded. So again, I don't have like a real audience there, which has probably suited me quite well, actually. And a bit like you were saying as well, Stephen, it's harder when you're reading stuff that is maybe serious, is that people tend to be quite po-faced in audiences, British audiences, don't they? And you don't really know what's going on. And yeah, so anyway, I'd rather someone took my book home and read it in the privacy of their own home and had their own experience with it without me as the author breathing down their neck, saying, what do you think? Do you like it? Oh, I didn't mean that. Did you notice that bit? Do you know what I mean? Like, I'll leave it. Yeah, you leave me to my writing, I'll leave you to your reading.
Yeah. I think what you're saying about the editorial thing and getting people to help you as well, because that the other thing that's right about trying to write a novel is editing. Because if you write a short story, it's easy to edit it because there's not much to read. To edit a novel, you have to read the entire thing again. So it must be good to have trusted people to help you with that one, because I'd imagine it must be pretty hard to go through an entire novel and edit it or come to it afresh.
I think you're totally right, Stephen. I think the problem with a novel, like a short story, you can kind of digest all in one go. So you can read it through in, 5 minutes and get a sense of the whole thing in one sitting. But with a novel, you can't. You can only see a little bit of it at a time. And it can often be really hard to get a sense whether the whole thing is working. Like it's like painting the Forth Road Bridge. By the time you've got to the end, you've forgotten what happened in the beginning. Does it hang together? I don't know. And yeah, I think it's just hard to, like we were saying before, it's hard sometimes to generate all the ideas and all the solutions to the plot problems or whatever that you need to come up with on your own. Sometimes you just need some other heads in the room to brainstorm with. So these days I have some kind of writer friends that will read sometimes. I also now have my agent and I have my official editor who will read. So I've got a nice team around me. But I was wondering, Daniel, do you have people that you get editorial input on, or do you find you're quite confident that you know the story and you can work it out yourself, or do you do that with anybody?
Yeah, with the Bone Flute, which is the fantasy, I'll show you so you know what I'm talking about. So that's the fantasy, the Bone Flute. That's the story collection, Scottish myths and legends. With the Bone Flute, I definitely needed editorial inputs, and it was the same with my previous one. So I started off with friends, ideally friends who wrote it. It's like creative, and thankfully I know some really wonderful, insightful, creative friends who I think gave me really good feedback, and that went on to a certain process, to a certain point, and then worked like a real official editor, and that was really helpful. I feel like with a novel, maybe you could manage and make it good enough without outside eyes, but you're going to make it so much better with those outside eyes, especially someone who does this for a living. So why wouldn't you? With Scottish Myths and Legends, I actually made the decision not to get outside help, and I didn't even actually give it to any beta readers. I gave people I know who enjoyed their correcting grammar, like a few stories each, to read over. I felt like it's probably going to sound a little bit arrogant, but I don't think it is. Just that I don't know of any editors who specialize in traditional stories, and I feel like I know the stories so well. Most of them I've been telling for 10 years. I've told to hundreds of audiences. I didn't really believe that I would get that much from an outside perspective.
It sounds like your audiences that you've been reading or telling these stories to have been your editors. So I'm sure you've honed those stories over that time. You'll have edited it yourself, every time you've told it. I'm sure you've worked on it a bit. And like you say, it sounds like it's really niche, and you don't want someone coming in who's trying to then make it into, I don't know, like what they think, you're trying to do, and you know this stuff inside out. So that's really interesting, actually. It sounds like you have a really good sense of what editorial input you need and when you need it. And I think that's really crucial, isn't it? Like if you ask for editorial input from the wrong person on the wrong thing at the wrong time, it can just completely send your piece of work off in totally the wrong direction, or just crush you, make you lose all confidence in what you're doing. So I think it's a skill in itself, knowing how to get editorial feedback and how to use it. I was just going to show you, this is my 6-page editorial letter from my editor for my second book. So again, she just covers so many things, and often it's most of them are suggestions and just picking up on things that she feels aren't quite there. And like I say, it can just be a really nice collaborative process. But it's always hard to get editorial input, because for me anyway, it just makes you know that you've got so much more work to do. And sometimes you're just like, I don't want to do it. I want you to tell me it's fine and I can just put my feet up. I don't want to have to rewrite it. But I know you're right. Shucks.